Thank you so much. And thank you all so much for coming, for the ADATH, giving me the opportunity, and Steve and Bonnie and Rabbi Whitman for setting things up. And I have a thank you here to everyone for tuning in and for waiting, especially on a Sunday evening before Pesach. It's very much appreciated. This is part of my ongoing research about Jewish cultural heritage in the margins, so to speak. So little known Jewish cultural heritage. And I'd be happy to share a PowerPoint later with some musical examples, the ones that I won't be singing, for anybody who's interested, or any CDs or clips and so on, for anyone who has any interest in this beautiful repertoire. I'm going to highlight the history and experiences of this little known Jewish community that was almost wiped out during the Holocaust. And where appropriate, I may sing or play some examples, just sing some examples to help you form a picture in your mind. This research goes back when I worked at the European Center for Jewish Music, which is located in Hanover, Germany, from 2016 to 2021 as a research associate. One day we got a call from a fellow who was a scholar of Greek origin living in Hamburg, about an hour and a half away from Hanover. And he said, hey, there's a guy who, a cantor, I think it's called, this guy was not Jewish. He said, there's a cantor who chants in the Romaniote tradition. I think you should go to Athens and seek him out. So we did, we flew there, and we met Chaim Mishakis, and this is kind of all about that journey, I suppose. I'll just paint a picture for you. It's a blistering day near Athens, Greece in the summer of 2017. I'm at the Restion Jewish Senior Home with cantor Chaim Mishakis. Restion is some distance from Athens. It's in a peaceful spot. It's surrounded by green hills and scrub that's characteristic of the region. The senior home has a mikvah, has a synagogue on its lower floor. And I'm basically just recording Chaim in the synagogue with my handheld Zoom device, and he reads a section from the Torah. As I listen to the Torah cantillation that highlights the drama of the Joseph story, I'm struck how this excerpt is at once familiar and unfamiliar. The musical patterns sound like something that I've heard before, but they don't correspond to any kind of Ashkenazi or Sephardic origin. The cantillation lacks the quarter tones heard in the cantillation of Jews, for example, of Middle Eastern origins, as well as the nasal inflection and blend of Arabic and Aramaic in some of the Yemenite cantillation styles. Some features are very interesting, such as the spoken, almost cut off sound on some of the words. Despite these differences, the consistency of the melodic pattern, the overall structure, and its application to the biblical text clearly identify it as Torah trope. The scholar Jeffrey Summit argues that Torah trope is in some way the cornerstone of community and the collective survival of liturgical traditions. So really, really interesting. Again, I don't have my PowerPoint, but I'll try and maybe sing you an example so you can hear it. I don't know who here chants Torah, or you have it in your ear. I'm sure everybody here has some sort of, when I say Torah cantillation, you can hear some sort of melodies in your ear. So I'll try to give you an example of that. Now, as an observant Jewish woman, I don't typically chant Torah except as an academic exercise, being a Jewish music person, and also for Rosh Chodesh in some context. So I'm going to chant a small portion from Rosh Chodesh so you can get an idea of what it sounds like. You might notice something very unusual about one of the trope markings. And again, I'm sorry that you can't see it on the screen, but just maybe listen and see if it sounds like anything that you're familiar with, or if it's very, very different from what you're familiar with. And everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Amazing. Okay, here we go. Uviyom HaShabbat sheni kavasim b'nei shana tmimim u'shnei eschonim solet mincha v'lula b'shemen v'nizko olat Shabbat b'Shabbato alulat hatamid v'nizkar ובראשי חודשיכם תקריבו לאדוני, ברימני בקר שניים, ואיל אחד כבשים, בני שנה שבעת מימים. ושלושה עשרונים סולת מנחה בלולב השמן לפח אחד, ושני עשרונים סולת מנחה בלולב השמן לאיל האחד. ויסרון יסרון סולת מנחה בלולב השמן לכבש האחד, ולריח ניחוח לי של אדוני, ונזכיהם חצי יין יהיה לפר, ושלישית ההין לאיל, לביט ההין לכבש יין. זאת עולת חודש בחודשו לחודשי השנה, וסיריזים אחד לחטאת לאדוני, על עולת התמיד יעשה ונזכור.
Wow.
So you have an idea of what that sonic world sounds like a little bit. Now, what you probably picked up on is that one of the trope markings called the ADATH is actually spoken. In German, it's called Sprechstimme. It's kind of sing speech. I don't know if anyone noticed that. And the ADATH, according to some interpretations, in a kind of phrase, if you want to call it, it marks the end of one idea and the beginning of another. That's one interpretation. But here it really stands out as a separator of sort of ideas. To give you another really known example, I guess, the first line of Bereshit, right? Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. It sounds something like this in the Yaniot, Romaniote or Yaniot trope. Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. Another one is, and Hashem said, let there be light, and there was light. So, Vayomer Elokim, Yeyo, Ve'yeyo. Apologies, tech things. Okay, good. So very, very interesting. I often translate it for my students. Is that, and God said, let there be light. And there was light, right? So it's very dramatic. And one of the things that I'm researching is how does this difference, how did these melodies change our reception as listeners of this wonderful oral tradition? Final example, the Shema, as it occurs in Deuteronomy, in the Yaniot trope, sounds something like this. Ve'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha b'chol levavcha b'chol nafshecha b'chol meodecha ve'ayu advarim ha'ele asher anochi metzavcha hayom al levavecha. So I hope that you see what I mean by sort of strikingly different. But you can hear the similar patterns. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that's interesting, but who are the Romaniotes? Where did they come from? Who are they today? And how can we document, preserve, and perform their music, given what little evidence survives and that there are very few historical sources? So you'd be interested to know, I overheard, Bonnie, when I was trying to access the Zoom, I overheard you saying that you know very little about the Romaniotes. So we don't know that much. There isn't that much historical evidence, but there is, if you look. We know that they've been in Greece for more than 2,000 years, residing on the Greek mainland and the islands, as well as in Constantinople and Asia Minor. They're associated with the Epirus region of northwest Greece, in which Yanina, so Yanina, you picture northwest Greece, kind of in the mountainous region, that is their spiritual, social, cultural, and historical capital. The term Romaniote generally denotes the Greek-speaking Jews of the Byzantine Empire, even if they primarily used Hebrew in their writings. The term is derived from the Latin designation for the Eastern Roman Empire, Romania, which became Byzantium after 330 CE. The earliest evidence of their presence on the Greek mainland dates only to the 3rd century BCE. According to Ray Dalvin was a Romaniote herself, who lived in New York and was a historian of the Romaniotes. According to her, oral histories maintain that a Roman slave ship was destroyed on the Albanian coast, resulting in the Jewish survivors settling in the area. And although there are no precise historical records of this event, it should be noted that there have been remains of Roman slave ships discovered off the coast of the Epirus region. And the Romaniotes from Yanina still describe their origins this way. I don't know anyone familiar with Rabbi Benjamin of Tudela, 1130 to 1173. He is a rabbi who traveled through the Byzantine Empire, and he left one of the earliest and most important accounts of Byzantine Jews. He notes that there were Jews in Corfu, Yanina, Arta, Patras, Chalkis, Salonika, Thebes, and Aphilon. So we do know that there were those Jewish communities then. This guy who was basically a merchant, but left this very detailed history about populations living in these areas. What's really interesting about the Romaniotes is that over the centuries, they really survived under very different rulers and regimes. Using a combination of scholarly sources on the Romaniotes and oral histories, I came up with an approximate timeline of Romaniote history. I have what I categorize as the Roman period, which is 146 BCE to 330 CE. We have the Byzantine period, 331 to 1082, the Frankish rule, 1082 to 1204. And this is all on the PowerPoint, anyone who's interested. The Venetian period, 1205 to 1453. And then the really long period, the Ottoman Empire, right? 1453 all the way up until 1913. Yet the 20th century corresponds to a period of Greek nationalism, which was difficult also for the Jewish minorities. And of course, later the complete devastation experienced during the Holocaust, particularly in Yanina and Salonika. And then we have the Romaniotes today in our globalized world. I would say in the Romaniote history, the most dramatic tensions were generated first by the arrival of the Sephardic communities who came to Greece following the Alhambra decree or the Spanish Inquisition, tab 1492 in Spain and 1497 in Portugal. In 1492, the Sultan Bezaid II offered an invitation to the Sephardim who'd been exiled from Spain and Portugal to come live in the Ottoman Empire. Most of these people were skilled craftsmen, merchants, rabbis, and scholars, and they were usually considered more urbane and sophisticated than their Romaniote counterparts. The Romaniotes tend to be fishermen, people who worked in the fields, small shop owners, and so on. The Sephardic communities newly arrived in Greece were rife with social and religious tensions, both amongst themselves and in relation to the Romaniotes. And this makes perfect sense if you think about how the Sephardim were displaced. They probably arrived in a new place completely traumatized. So of course, there were inner tensions and then tensions with these new Jewish communities on the Greek mainland that they encountered. The two communities gradually reconciled their differences, even as they remained relatively distinct culturally. In 1597, so we're only up to the 1500s, the Romaniotes adopted the prayers of the Sephardim so that they could, quote, be united as Jews. But what happened eventually is that the Romaniotes kind of got pushed out of the main urban centers as the majority and pushed sort of into the hinterlands of Greece. So for example, Yanina, it's in a mountainous area. It's quite difficult to get to, or was certainly in the past difficult to get to. Before the Holocaust, Yanina was the largest Romaniote community in Greece, and it was the heart of the Romaniotes, both literally and symbolically. The long and distinctive history of the Romaniote Jews almost ended during the Nazi occupation of Greece, which began on April 4th, 1941, when Allied forces on the Albanian side were defeated. By the end of May, Greece had fallen under the control of Nazi Germany. After May 1941, Greece was divided into 3 zones of occupation, overseen by Germans, Bulgarians, and Italians. Both Athens and Ioannina were at first under Italian control, which improved life for the Romaniotes, as the Italians did not deport the Jews living in areas that they controlled. But a German division arrived in Ioannina in 1943, and on March 25th, 1944, they deported nearly all the Jewish population to Auschwitz. Of approximately 2,000 men, women, and children, only approximately 163 adults survived. Other Greek cities with Romaniote Jews, such as Chalkis, Patras, and Athens, suffered similar losses, as did the Sephardic communities in Greece, particularly in Salonika, which was a hub for Sephardic rabbinical leadership. As in the case of the Jews of Ioannina, many survivors chose not to go back to Greece. Now, I'm going to just recount a very weird coincidence, and that, if you notice, the date is March 25th, 1944, when the Romaniote Jews were deported to Auschwitz. When I spoke about the Romaniotes for the first time in public some years ago, it was just so happened that my talk fell on March 25th at the Lincoln Center in New York, that it was. And I spoke to some of the survivors, which was a very meaningful, wonderful experience. And I note that I couldn't have spoken yesterday for you guys because it was Shabbos, but yesterday was March 25th as well. So I don't make too much out of it. I just note that it's a very strange coincidence. Maybe I just have more time during that period, heart between Purim and Pesach. I don't know, but it's a strange thing. The point is, I feel that we are all interconnected with this history. Although I'm not Romaniote myself, to my knowledge, we're all part of Am Yisrael, and I feel this connection very strongly when I talk about the Romaniotes and when I study their liturgy and their music. The decimation of the Jewish population of Greece caused many of these distinctive practices of Romaniotes to dwindle and some to disappear. But the tradition did continue in three main locations. And I should say it did continue, but on a very small scale. So in Israel, some Romaniote traditions continued for a time in Yerushalayim at the Bet Avraham and Ohel Sarah Synagogue in the Montefiore district, and Kfar Shalem at Shalom Synagogue. Now, the Shalom Synagogue is really interesting because it was established by the former Romaniote Jewish community of the island of Zakynthos. In the island of Zakynthos, all the Jews there were saved from deportation by the Christian community living there, who refused to let it's a long story, and you can read about it. It's Dino Seder wrote it, and it's called A Miracle at Zakynthos. So that whole community survived thanks to the kindness of these people. So that's in Israel. In New York, services using the Romaniote rite continued at New York City at Kehila Kadosha Ioannina. It was established in 1906 by Greek-speaking Romaniote Jews who'd immigrated there from the city of Ioannina specifically. Synagogue membership there peaked in the 1930s. Very interesting. And New York is kind of more accessible for us, I think, from Montreal than Athens or Israel. So if you ever get a chance, I strongly recommend visiting the synagogue. There's a museum upstairs. The people are very friendly and warm and welcoming. It's a fascinating experience. Now the shul, Kehila Kadosh Ioannina, is in Chinatown. But at the time, if you watch footage or if you interview people, what's absolutely fascinating is they say that the languages that you heard in the street the most were Yavanic, which is Judeo-Greek, and Ladino, Judeo-Spanish. So just kind of thinking about that is rather incredible, and all these different populations that pass through this area. They also said when, after the devastation of the Holocaust, they would go to Ellis Island and wait to see if there were any Greek-speaking Jews who would come off the boats. They could then take them and support them into the community. It's very, sometimes it's hard not to be moved, not to be, or, moved in a way that you can't do your research even by these stories and the people that you encounter. So, apologies. Finally, Greece itself, which was kind of my focus for the most part. Romaniote practices have lived on. mainly through the efforts of a handful of practitioners, among them the person who I worked with, Cantor Chaim Ishakis. So in other words, over the past 2,000 years, you have this rich, incredible history, you have this oral tradition, and you do have these Romaniotes, not just with distinctive music, but with unique religious cultural practices, language, you have clothing, cuisine, and their particular musical repertoires. If I can't get into all the sort of cultural differences, but it's absolutely fascinating. They have, for example, a kind of birth certificate / amulet for baby boys called an aleph. Just really, really, really interesting. And Judeo-Greek itself is absolutely fascinating because it's written in Hebrew characters, but it's mainly Greek words. And for anyone who's interested, on the PowerPoint, I had this song called Kina Glossa, which means start tongue to speak. It's a Purim song. It's traditional from Yanina, and it's written in Judeo-Greek. You see the letters. There's about 50 verses, and it's all about Esther and Mordechai. It starts, I'll just read the translation. Start tongue to speak. Tell of the miracles long ago. Wake up the sleepy ones and make them drunk with wine. Eat, drink, and be merry. Do not forget the Almighty Hashem. Speak of the freedom that he brought us. Do not forget those in need. Send gifts to everyone. Invite to your homes the rich and the poor. Everyone praise Hashem. So it's a very lively kind of happy song, and again written in Yavanic, which is very very difficult to read. So one of the reasons that a lot of the repertoire was lost, a lot of the music was lost, the leader of the community in Yanina, by the name of Allegra Matza, remarked to me, we never imagined that such devastations should occur, so we never wrote down the melodies and so on. So they just had no idea that that was going to happen. So one of the things that I did when I was in Germany is I started, and apologies for being on the phone, but I started a what's called an ethnographic recording series, and it's to document the traditions. There's about 6 CDs in there. I wrote a detailed booklet on, you know, what the traditions are about, who the singer is, and so on. That's not the only one. We have the Romaniote tradition, but also there's this one from Mumbai to Sydney, oral traditions of synagogue chant in the Jewish Babylonian diaspora. So we just started this series of Jewish music that was in danger of disappearing, if you like, and going out and recording it. And the idea was kind of to do field recordings like Amnon Shiloach. He's an Israeli ethnomusicologist, and he does these recordings where you want to capture the recordings in their kind of organic context. Now, we're never going to go and make recordings on Shabbat or on Yom Kippur, Chas v'Shalom, but we will sort of take them in a synagogue space, in the space where they would have sounded. And for part of my field work in 2018 and 2022, I traveled to Yanina to participate in and observe the Yom Kippur service, which was led almost single-handedly by Cantor Ishakis. And this was quite a feat because the morning service alone went from 7 a.m. to 3 p.m. They sing a lot of additional piyutim. So it was just really, really, really an incredible experience. Many participants experienced the travel as a return, whether they're coming from Athens, New York, or elsewhere. This is a little bit interesting because most of the time when we talk about kibbutz galiyot or we talk about a return, we're referring to Israel. But here we're coming to Yanina. And I have to say, even if it weren't for my research, the experience that I had there was one of the most intense spiritual experiences one could ever have. It was a bit challenging to sort of navigate kosher food and things like this, but if you're used to traveling, it was definitely possible. And just the town itself, there are so many layers of history. There's the Ottoman fortress wall, within which the old synagogue is housed, the Kahal Kadosh Yashan. And there's sort of these Arabic inscriptions. You can see the layers of history that I just mentioned. You see them alive in that town. And I made a point. I flew to Athens directly. And it was sort of funny because it's the fall and there were a lot of, everyone on the plane except for me were sort of these French Canadian retired people going on holiday to Greece. So I'm sat there on the plane thinking these sort of penitent thoughts. And we have like some people popping champagne corks and partying on the plane. So it was a bit funny, but it did sort of strengthen that sense of pilgrimage, that sense of travel. And when you're walking around the town, what you notice is these kind of vestiges of the Jewish life that was there before. Stars of David in the steel of shutters, this Hebrew writing, or writings in Judeo-Greek on the walls. And it's very intense. You can feel the layers of history. It's almost what Eva Hoffman says about the former Jewish communities of Eastern Europe, that their absence is almost felt like a presence. So I'm trying to think of some sort of examples to convey some of the music. Say, we're not talking about the golden age of Chazanut. Many of the melodies are just very simple, still very moving. And some of them are simple because they're made for community singing. So they can't be too intricate, especially when you're talking about slichot or piyutim that people are repeating over and over and over. If the melodies were too complex, then nobody could sort of follow along, I suppose. There's one I like. It's called, don't know if anyone's familiar with it. It's called Yashen al Teradam, sleeper, do not slumber. And of course, we're not talking about sleep, literally talking about spiritual lethargy. So the shofar is supposed to wake you up. So too is the song, I suppose. It goes something like this, very simple. Yashen al teradam va'azov italecha harchek tachei adam v'shur dachei gvoecha ma'lecha nirdam ma'lecha nirdam. Imagine that times 100 or whatever it is. So it's almost March-like, right? It's certainly wake up, you know. Sometimes in my class, I'll just start singing it for my students if I'm talking, if they, you know, if their heads are bent on their desks. So that works really well too. Another one which you might be familiar with is called El Nora Alila. Don't know who's familiar with that one. It's a piyut that begins the Ne'ilah service in most Romaniote and Sephardic services at the conclusion of Yom Kippur. It's very, I really am moved by the imagery. It's this idea, the closing of the gates is kind of the refrain. Besha'at ha'ne'ilah, at the closing of the gates. So there's all these verses, this will happen at the closing of the gates. So I'll sing a small sample, I guess, from that one. What I like about it is it's designed for call and response. So you have this very florid beginning that the cantor sings, or very slow, and then you have the response. And of course, by that time you're starving and you're kind of dizzy, and you say, oh, it's the light at the end of the tunnel. It's the final chance to sort of get that, you know, get that prayer in. So I very much like that. I like that we're sort of called upon to respond. It goes something like this. El nora alila, el nora alila, hamti lanu mechila b'sha'at hane'ilah. Zchot itkat aviyem, v'chadesh et yamehem, kekedemu techila b'sha'at hane'ilah. And it gets you going through that last bit. The poem is attributed to Moses ibn Israel, who's a 12th century poet from Spain. And it's got its own kind of feel. In fact, listening to a lot of the Romaniote repertoire, if I'm making a kind of simple description, for me, it's almost in between some Ashkenazi and some Sephardic practices. It's almost a kind of, we call it in academic scholarship, a liminal space or a gray zone, if you like. Trying to think so I talked about it, Nora Alila. I want to mention one more thing, and I know like I started late, so I'm being aware of that a little bit, but I think I really would like to talk about something very special that's done, and it has to do with the piyut Unatane Tokef. Let us speak of the day's sacred power. As most of you know, probably it's a piyut that's been part of the Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur liturgy in some traditions of Judaism for centuries. It's chanted for the Kedusha, sanctification of the Musaf service. Niren describes the prayer as, quote, one of the most iconic sections of the Rosh Hashanah liturgy, a dramatic and terrifying poem which depicts God as the ultimate judge of all living souls on the annual Day of Remembrance. Ishakis's rendition of Unatane Tokef is particularly moving. Now, as an ethnomusicologist, we do transcribe a lot of music and we talk about this tone and that tone. I'm not going to do that. I just want to relay some characteristics about it that I hope you find meaningful. There's a lot of word painting that occurs. For example, man coming from dust and going back to dust. That's kind of depicted musically, not by going from one note and ending on the same note in a kind of sighing motive. I won't do him justice, but it sounds something like Adam Yesodom Yafar V'Sofo Le'afar Benafsho Lavilachmo. So we started here and we ended here, right? So it's kind of musically enhancing the words, but perhaps the most astonishing thing that happened there. I want you to picture a Romaniote synagogue. The bima is on one end and it's very much elevated. So it's almost like a pulpit, if you like, in the middle of the space. Then there's a pathway. It's kind of like the ADATH, women on that side, men on that side, and there's a path through, and then there's the ark. And we're all floor level, except for the bima, which is high and raised. During Unatane Tokef, the Torah ark is opened up, and it's almost like a cavern. It's not like a flat wall like we have in some shuls where the Torah is just sort of perched there. It's like a house. You have to actually, your whole body has to like reach in to take them out almost. And when they're chanting Unatane Tokef, the ark is wide open. And all the congregation comes forward and is kind of looking with bated breath almost. And Ishakis will chant the whole of Unatane Tokef. And then there's kind of a pause. And there's almost an imperceptible musical shift. And he chants the same words in Demotiki, in modern Greek, to a Romaniote tune. As spoken in Epirus, this language is mixed with Turkish, Italian, and Hebrew words. It's a remnant of many years lived under Turkish rule, during which the Romaniotes, they were on one hand respected by Muslims as al-Kitab, the people of the book, but on the other hand as a vulnerable minority with dhimmi and therefore subordinate status. In that musical example, the Hebrew and Greek texts are clearly delineated. And he sings in a slightly different key. So it's not like a key change in a pop song, like Celine Dion singing My Heart Will Go On. She goes up a step to show the drama. It's a very imperceptible drop. And I would say if you had to sort of pinpoint the peak, the denouement, the most spiritual moment of that service, it would be then at that time. Added to that, beside the Aron HaKodesh, we have, in most shuls, in most synagogues, you will have sort of plaque of those who we revere, who have passed away. We have those names kind of in the atrium of the shul. In Romaniote synagogues, you will have them right beside the Aron HaKodesh. And here, you have the names of all who perished in the Holocaust right beside the Aron HaKodesh, and it's kind of a focal point when you talk about who will live and who will die in that year, for those people to reconnect with their families who are symbolically there beside the Torah Ark. So it's moving on so many levels, and many people expressed that when they come to this place, they remember who they are and remember their families who perished. And then you have, of course, hymns like El Nora Alila that are more kind of forward-looking as well as more optimistic. I could share a few other examples, but suffice it to say, there's a rich array of different songs. Just a note of interest is that in some of the songs you can hear very clearly, at least I can, very clearly the Italian influence, especially in the Romaniote repertoire that come from Corfu. So you hear this very almost bright sound, a very intricate kind of sound. So you hear, even within the repertoire, you hear all these nuances, and you hear the layers of history in the music as you begin to uncover the different influences. And for me, it's been an absolute pleasure to be studying this and so on. I'll just, I guess, finish. I'll just wrap up with some thoughts, and I think, Rabbi, this hopefully ties in nicely with what you said about the Mishkan on Shabbos. And I apologize if I'm not paraphrasing you correctly, but you said something that Hashem should dwell in the hearts of the builders of the Mishkan and not necessarily the physical space itself. So while Khurban, or destruction, experienced during the Holocaust is a core experience of the Romaniote Jews, Khurban also applies in another sense in temporal context. In his lexicon or treatise, Sefer Shlomo, The Delight of Solomon, the Hebrew linguist and poet Rabbi Solomon Pappenheim explains that the biblical usage of the word Khurban denotes that which is not inherently damaged, but can be considered destroyed, owing to its disconnection from what it requires to live. Thus, a ghost town can be termed a Khurban because it is abandoned by human inhabitants.
You have a second microphone.
Hello?
Better.
Oh, fixed it. So the places themselves are not visibly damaged. I hear it echo.
Miranda, you have some second device. Okay. I'm not sure why that's happening.
Now I have to leave you on a cliffhanger.
If I could ask, let's see, are we fixed now? Yeah, I think we're fixed. I think we're fixed now. Go ahead,
Okay.
and then I have some questions to ask, Miranda.
Amazing. Thank you. So the places themselves, in this sense, are not visibly damaged, yet their lack of a living, practicing Jewish population precludes them from being considered a thriving settlement. In the case of a synagogue, the absence of regular Jewish prayer and religious activities is what generates the status of Khurban. The Kahal Kadosh Yashan synagogue in Yanina, and even the town as a whole, could be designated Khurban because of the absence of Jewish life. And the mayor, actually, who's Jewish, comments on the difficulty of keeping Judaism alive, Romaniote Judaism alive. I would say it's the process of Zecher that reverses the emptiness that constitutes Khurban. Once a year, the town of Yanina, now relatively devoid of a Jewish presence, is suddenly replete with Jewish visitors. So through this annual pilgrimage, which is a ritual in its own right, the Khurban of both the city and synagogue is negated as the city is restored and reanimated through this service. While the pilgrimage and service are temporary, they're cyclical. So the Jewish presence in all its splendor is both short and long-lived. And I feel even speaking to people about these traditions, past and present, I see myself as being privileged to be a part of this process of reanimation.
Wow.
Thank you.
This is absolutely amazing. Miranda, thank you so much. First of all, I have a couple of very short comments to make, but if you have a question, please write it in the chat and I will try to communicate that to Miranda to be able to answer. I do realize we've gone over the time, but this is absolutely worthwhile. And I did not know anything about this before, Miranda, you told us about it. Let me, a couple of very brief comments. Number one, we at ADATH sing Kel Nora Elila every Yom Kippur. It is absolutely my favorite tune that we sing right before Ne'ilah, and that's something that I'm very proud we do. Malacha Nirdam, of course, is a quote from the book of Jonah, and I will say that one of my favorite versions of that is now a popular song sung by Yishai Ribo, who has a beautiful, beautiful song, Malacha Nirdam. So that is going on. I have a few kind of short questions to ask you, Miranda. Number one, can you give us very briefly an idea of the population? Let's say in ancient times, in middle times, in modern times, what kind of numbers are we talking about with the Romaniote people?
That's a really hard question to answer, like concisely. Most of the time we just don't know. But then there are these sort of statistics that show up from town to town. So there were some in Asia Minor, I believe, that a colleague of mine sort of analyzed. That, I mean, the short answer is we don't really know. And you really have to look in obscure sources to find it. So I looked, the wife of a French diplomat who was stationed in Yanina during the Ottoman rule, who kept a diary, mentioned some of the population. So even the fact that they were there is hard to track down, let alone actual numbers. But the scholar who I mentioned in Hanover, Panagiotis Kakumas, will probably have a better answer. Yanina was about 2,000 there. So we're not talking about huge numbers.
Okay, let me ask the question slightly differently. Today, if I want to go to a place to experience this culture and this group of Jews in practice, that is not a museum, but like a shul that has a minyan, which is you who are using these tunes and have these customs, where in the world would I go today?
You could go hear a variant at Kehila Kadosha Yanina, which is in New York. So that's a possibility. Some very committed young people have sort of taken the reins, and very committed older people too. So that's possible. It's a different nusach. It's a different style than the Greek. You could go hear Chaim Ishakis, but he's not affiliated with a specific congregation. He performs throughout Greece at different times of year, the Jewish calendar. There's also a synagogue in Athens, but it's a disappearing tradition. There are very few practitioners. I'd say there's a handful of practitioners of this music, which is partly why at that time, 2016, we took it on ourselves to go out and record it.
After this is over, Miranda, perhaps you and I can discuss the possibility of some way of being able to share some of this music so that it is remembered. What you sang is very, very beautiful. I noticed right away the difference in the trup, the way the Torah was presented, and maybe we can figure out together a way to be able to do that. What was the relationship between the Jews of this group and the majority Greek culture at that time? Did they get along? Were they a minority? Were they mistreated? Were they treated well?
So as you saw the timeline, it was largely dependent on what part of that timeline. What's incredible is just this long-lived community, how they negotiated these challenges, the challenges of living under the dominance of these very different communities. I will say during the Ottoman Empire, during that long period, things were relatively amicable. I mean, they were more taxed. They had dhimmi status. So it wasn't, you know, as far from being perfect, but things were relatively stable. There was a good relationship by and large. If we talk about the town of Yanina, between the people, and in fact, many people say we didn't even, you know, other than practicing different customs and going to the synagogue, we saw ourselves as inhabitants of Yanina. We didn't see ourselves as Jews and non-Jews. So I think that's very telling as to how what the sentiments were like, what the relationships were like at that time.
Wow. Miranda, this has been a fantastic, really uniquely interesting presentation. You have brought to all of us something that I dare say none of us knew about before. And I'm very, very grateful to you. So I want to thank you very much. And I now want to turn this over to Bonnie, who
Yes.
I believe is going to close the program. So Miranda, you stay where you are. And Bonnie, I'm adding you, but I'm going to remove myself just to say thank you, Miranda. Thank you, Bonnie. Thank you, Steve and Sheila, and all of those who have worked so hard to make this amazing program. There we go. Bonnie, take it away.
Okay, so I thanked all the participants at the beginning, at the opening of this program, but I'm going to thank you again for being so curious, so interested, so involved, open-minded, and you were a fabulous audience. And as some people said in the chat, it was definitely worth the wait. Miranda, your subject matter is so interesting, so different, and we really enjoyed this, and we enjoyed your delivery, and even without the visuals, you were able to describe and sing in such a way that you know, only a true professional can pull that off as beautifully as you did. Thank you, Rabbi Whitman. You're welcome, for helping support our programs. You're insightful, knowledgeable, and we really appreciate your involvement in the program, and I would love to see a further partnership between the ADATH and you, Dr. Crowdus. You're really just a gem. I don't know how to say and how to thank you enough for bringing this program, and we look forward to really continuing on the Romaniote, but also on South Tel Aviv, and you know, the many other subjects that I'm sure are just as interesting, if not more interesting. Although would be hard to second this one. Thank you, Stephen Spodek, for
Bonnie.
Yes.
I'd like to add something that hasn't been mentioned yet, that on Sunday, April 30th, we have Norma Joseph, a colleague of Miranda, doing she'll be in conversation for us with Shelley Pomeranz. Shelley is a former CBC arts and cultural reporter, and Norma Joseph will be talking about something she does a lot of research on exploring ethnic and religious communities through food. So look for that.
She's an amazing speaker.
Food and music, what more could we ask for, right? I mean, this is life. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Sheila, and the entire sisterhood for being a great support. To Stu Gutman and Jackie in the office, who go above and beyond their IT and practical work. Without them, this would just be a concept and never would have come to full fruition. And thank you for the IT gurus up there who made this possible, even though Concordia, well, I don't know, we managed to pull it off. So last but not least, thank you, Dr. Miranda Crowdus, for sharing your research with us and whetting our appetite for more programs with you.
Thank you so much for having me, and big apologies for the technical issues. And thank you for sticking it out to my audience, to the participants. Thank you for having me, and I would be delighted to speak more on any topics that are of interest.
Thank you
Fabulous.
very much.